I have just a couple questions for staff, I guess, maybe some discussion. There was sort of some themes that came up, both in our comments and our letters, as well as the speakers today. And I was just wondering if we get staff to speak a little bit to them. Specifically, there was a lot of comments about the toxic remediation, rail safety, and air quality not being fleshed out in this plan, as well as the funding mechanism and the financing portion. So I'm wondering if staff could just speak to what that process looks like moving forward.
Yeah, so Pete Bowman, Bureau Planning staff here. With regard to the hazmat issues, the consolidated response 4.15 in the final EIR directly responds to those questions. That was one of the items that we did a consolidated response on. In quick summary, the mitigation that was adopted, and it was identified as less than significant, requires that this go to DTSC for approval. The issue is that the remedial action plan cannot be approved prior to adoption and certification of the EIR. So that process has to wait. So it's kind of cart and the horse type issue. However, there has been a human health and ecological risk assessment done that was prepared and approved by DTSC as part of the ongoing process. The studies and the process of the applicant working with DTSC has identified the contamination that's on site that's of concern for human health, and they've also identified necessary levels of cleanup or basically making sure that there's no direct contact to residents that would be living there, so that it meets the residential levels, and all of that is covered within that consolidated response. For air quality issues, this is a tricky one. Obviously, this is an AB 617 area, and the WOCAP was adopted to address a lot of those issues. One thing as it relates to the CEQA thresholds on this is that two things. One, from a cumulative aspect, when the background levels already exceed the threshold, you're in a situation where you cannot add anything to it. In all project and operations, as long as people are driving cars or building buildings that, with machines that create emissions, there will be emissions. So that's one issue. And mitigations have been identified that, has requirements that all feasible mitigation be included, and that is to target basically getting it below the threshold or as close as possible. The reason it remains significant and avoidable is that it's not known if they can get to that level. Same thing with the project related impacts regarding on the project level with regard to construction and operation. Those emissions, often when you're looking at thresholds, you're looking at a sort of per capita impact. So, there would be like a performance-based metric. However, in this case, it's just a flat rate, like the numbers for the toxic air contaminants. Those are flat numbers. So the bigger the project, the bigger those emissions get. So you don't get to break it out. So if this was broken into a bunch of little project sites, as you'd see around other, parts of, with infill development, they would be coming in less than under the threshold. Given that the sheer size of the project, there are issues with trying to get that below. However, once again, mitigations have been identified, and I can hand it off to Brian Schuster from ESA, who's the air quality expert, that can go further into the additional WOCAP measures that have been identified. However, as I was saying, it still requires all feasible mitigation, and the target being to get it below the threshold. And I'm not sure if there was a third item that was in that.
Yeah, real quick, I will say just DTSC is Department of Toxic Control Services for the state, in case that's new terminology. I find that we often talk in acronyms and initialisms, so I like to define them. And then the third part was just if you could discuss the financing piece as it relates to this document.
Yeah, so the financing piece, that's all going to be tied into, and I'm assuming this is talking about the ongoing discussions that have been out there with regard to offsite infrastructure financing, creation of an infrastructure financing district. Those are really separate from this EIR. The point of the EIR is to identify the impacts of the project, and it's not relative to who's paying for what of the project.
Great. Thank you very much.
So Commissioner Shirazi, that work good? Okay, terrific. Okay, so Commissioner Segru.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair. Pete, I was hoping you could cover, I know we had heard from a few commenters and we received a few letters around the rail safety issues. And I personally felt like the consolidated response around 4.6 was really sufficient, but I was hoping we could just touch on it now that we have a lot of active participants here in terms of the safety mechanisms that we will put in place around game day and what the EIR identifies in terms of those northmost streets being the most viable in terms of an overcrossing. So thank you.
Yeah, so one issue that was identified is we created a mitigation to address the to address the at-grade rail crossings that requires a grade separation pedestrian bridge that would access the site. So in the event that, trains are blocking, and this would really be looking to run down along to where we're looking at the transportation hub going on 2nd Street. So as people are coming off, it'd be a direct route to go into the site. However, acknowledging that, people are still coming down through, from downtown coming into the site, there's a lot of people that are going to be entering Jack London Square and then pursuing to the ballpark along Water Street. So with that in mind, a full grade separated, entirety of everything is really a feasibility issue with really cutting off Jack London from the rest of the city and creating that sort of walled off approach right there. If you were to grade separate all those crossings, the other issue is that you're going to have a lot of taking issues and condemnation issues with regard to businesses and properties that have access off of those streets now that would no longer have access. So just from that standpoint, that was one issue with grade sepping everything through Jack London Square and down along Embarcadero. The other thing that I had mentioned earlier was the project alternative that does include the grade separation, and it studied both Market and Brush Street approaches into the site. There were difficulties with having all of the new ones grade separation because you end up basically putting an elevated roadway system that goes into the site and really starts to illuminate a lot of the site plan, and then, really kind of, again, walls it off from everything else. And, that is really also a feasibility issue. And, getting back to what is proposed also with the mitigations for the at-grade rail crossings, basically what's proposed as part of that mitigation is a plan that would put in fencing down along Embarcadero so that people can no longer cut through the block. Right now, you'll have trains stopped, and I've seen it myself, and people walk out and just jump the train. That will now be fenced off. At the intersections, they will have what's called quad gates that basically block vehicles from going in any direction, so that it really does limit that. Further, the transportation management plan, which is one of the mitigations that's included in the document to really address VMT and trip reduction measures, also includes a lot of measures for just overall traffic management on game days. One of the things that's also identified for game days is to have traffic control officers at those intersections, so that in addition to the measures that's in place, because people could, potentially go around the gates or jump, there will be traffic control officers there to stop and prevent that from happening as well. I hope that answers the question. If there's any other questions, I also have Rob Reese from Fair and Pierce, who's the traffic consultant, if we need to dig deeper into the technical aspects.
No, thank you, Pete. That was sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Scruggs. Vice Chair Fern, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Manis. I just kind of want to build up Commissioner Segru's question around the rail safety. So could you, Pete, or someone from ESA describe why traffic hazards are still listed as significant and unavoidable, given the proposed mitigations that are that have been put forth? I can answer that real quickly. So
The issue is that you have all these grade separated crossings, and the measures that are being proposed as part of the mitigation, those are basically subject to a different agency's approval. Those would all be subject to review and approval by the CPUC, or the California Public Utilities Commission. So because of that required approval, we can't definitively say that all of these measures will go in place and these issues will be resolved. Further, with the mitigations for the grade separated crossing, like I said, we still acknowledge that people will still be crossing the tracks further down, and so that doesn't fully reduce it, but it does lessen it as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Commissioner Lamone.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Manis. Pete, there were some comments about Chinatown's involvement in the process and a traffic impact report being available in April. So can you talk a little bit about how that report can be incorporated into the future planning process moving forward?
Yeah, so for last several months, there's been a working group with city staff and the Chinatown representatives that have been joining those meetings, and a lot of those discussions took place. And we had Rob Reese from Fair and Piers, attend those meetings and talk about things that could be done to address congestion or anything like that, issues, and that's consistent with the resolution that was adopted as part of the term sheet that basically, said to focus on those issues, in particular with regard to the implementation of the transportation management plan that I was just discussing. So, in addition to the trip reduction and the measures that are being looked at the railroad crossings, it was also envisioned that this document has to be a living document because transportation modes often change. Who would have, thought about scooters, 20 years ago? So all of these things need to be kept in mind. And it's always been envisioned that that document would be updated and revised prior to project approval, and probably again prior to issuance of a building permit, and possibly even again before opening day. And really, it's just to keep up with everything and to be able to modify the document and shift measures as needed. So there may be instances where we have a lot of traffic control officers. We may find out, we don't really need those, so we can amend it and take them away from those intersections. Or we may find out, there's some issues here that weren't necessarily anticipated because people's mode shifted. So now we need to focus on putting the traffic control officer here. So all of those things are anticipated within that transportation management plan. And the studies that are happening now are not additional CEQA studies. It's more about analysis of queuing and level of service that are not CEQA matters, but really that we'd be looking at in terms of informing what the TMP can provide and advise for in those areas within Chinatown.
Okay, Commissioner Rink.
My fellow commissioners have taken all of my questions, so that's good. I have a couple left. But before I ask a couple questions, I wanted to reinforce, Pete, something that you said in response to Commissioner or Vice Chair Fern about how some of the findings of significance and unavoidable for the impacts are simply because there's this extra jurisdictional authority. So while it seems scary for the public to see this long list of significant and unavoidable impacts, and it's one of those nuances of CEQA that the lead agency has to declare that it's significant and unavoidable if they can't control the outcome. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce that, as you had pointed it out to the vice chair. So while we're kind of going over some of the threads that we heard, one of the things that came up a bunch was the truck relocation and displacement. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great. And then I was also curious if staff had any kind of position on the Oakland Heritage Alliance's suggested rewording of the cultural resources mitigation number 7. Thanks.
Yeah, so I can touch on both of those. So for the truck relocation, the comment, a couple of the comments I heard, one was, concern that We had talked about speculation as to where the trucks would go and that there could be increased VMT. And that is correct. We did say that we cannot speculate where all these trucks would move to, and CEQA does not allow that kind of level of speculation. What we did do when we analyzed potential relocation is that, we've been working with the port all along on this EIR. So we've been talking with them about identifying what potential locations could they go. And one of the sites that was identified was the Roundhouse property. And we looked at different properties within, the port, and that was the one that we studied from a conservative standpoint as well, to identify what the greatest level of air quality impacts would be for this area, because those would have the closest sensitive receptors to it. So again, a lot of the times when we're doing analysis in EIR, we're trying to find the worst case scenario so that we can, be, fully transparent about what the worst impacts could potentially be. With regard to the concerns about them going to the communities, there are WOCAP measures that have been put in place. The city's adopted the truck management plan and is working on continuing to implement that. And that should really be in place. That will be preventing trucks from moving and parking into the streets within West Oakland, which has been historically a problem in the area, and that's acknowledged. And with regard to, I'm not sure if there's anything else on the truck relocation or not. I'm not sure if you want to.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. And then with regard to Oakland Heritage Alliance's comments on the mitigation, when, the language should to shall, in my opinion, is not that big of a difference. When you're talking about something from a set of design guidelines, it may make a difference. But what we're talking about is a mitigation, and there's not an option to say, the language is put in the context of, the station should be designed to have the, smallest footprint possible. So it's not like they could come forward with such a proposal and just say, well, it says should, so we're not going to do it. It is a mitigation, therefore it's required. Nonetheless, I would recommend that they also provide that commentary to the city council. And if it's something that they would like to see changed, it's something that we could certainly address, I believe.
Thanks, Pete.
Okay, Pete, I have a sort of maybe a broader based question, and my fellow commissioners obviously did great on asking the range of questions they do, but one of the things that sort of stands out to me is this, and the document's really intended to focus on this, is a long-term battle between the priority of industrial and port uses versus a sports village. And I guess the thing that's not clear to me, even in the document in terms of specificity, maybe this is certainly the purview of the council in terms of us providing additional information, is that how do they, through this document, weigh the dual priorities that the city is putting forward in this document as a result of the retention of industrial uses related to the port and trucking, and the creation of a stadium and a village associated with it?
Well, I think what we're looking at from an environmental impact standpoint is we're looking at the land use chapter first and foremost, and one of those being, does it physically divide an established community, or does it create a fundamental conflict? So we did not believe that it was in a situation of, physically dividing a community. That's something more left for, when a freeway is, punched through a neighborhood, or something really like does create a physical divide. We feel that this site is not integrally connected into the actual seaport itself, and it's actually would just become it sits between the middle of Jack London Square and the other seaport properties, and it's not integrally connected into all those other streets. So we did not feel that there was an argument for saying that it would physically divide an established community at all. What we really focused in on the EIR process is what issues could come up that would really create an issue, leaning towards sort of the fundamental conflict of, this use on those activities. So there are a number of mitigations in there that talk to, some of the things that were raised about water safety. There's actually mitigation that requires OPD patrols to enforce the channel regulations. So, there's always been concerns about kayaks sort of sitting out in the area, similar to how they do with what's it called now? Oracle Field, almost called it Pac Ballpark, out in the McCovey Cove. So one, if balls were hit into the estuary from here, it'd be a pretty monster home run. I think somewhere close to 1,000 feet. But nonetheless, there's certainly the concern of the kayaks coming just because their activity is happening there. So we did put in that mitigation requiring the boat patrols in the area. We also have other things that are sort of like buffers in place to soften the edges. And then there's also the limitation on residential on the west end of the project site. So it kind of takes those residents away for concerns about complaints or air quality, noise, those kind of things. So it sort of creates that buffer by shifting the residents further to the east. So really that was the context that we looked at in terms of like what would be potential conflicts.
Let me just
And then a lot of the transportation analysis was also done to relieve a lot of the issues too, with trucks coming in and out as well.
So let me just sort of follow up. So thanks for that starter on that. The sort of companion part of that is, I guess what I would describe as the scale of the proposed project under maximum CEQA analysis versus the alternative, which is an encroachment in the turning basin option. And what I've sort of read as a layperson is the importance of the port, the revenue generation of the port, particularly at a time during this COVID era where supply chains are really being challenged and stuff like that. And I guess I sort of wonder about that chunk that would put the turning basin as an alternative versus a sort of given as a part of the primary project. So maybe you could talk about that relative to that. And I realized the project sponsor decided that, and we looked at the alternative, but the balance in my mind is also about ensuring that both what you described, both the industrial and the sports village basically can live side by side. So can you shed a little light on that?
Yeah, so to the turning basin, as I tried to touch on earlier, the Maritime Reservation scenario is not the turning basin. The purpose of the Maritime Reservation scenario is to look at what would potential impacts be. May they be different from the baseline project in the event that the maximum 10 acres is taken out of the project site as is currently allowed as part of the term sheet with the port. So the turning basin is a separate project that is proceeding currently with the port. So what the Maritime Reservation scenario is representing is the maximum area that the port could take back. And what would that be in the event that that turning basin was that large? I believe currently they're moving forward, and I think the turning basin as proposed now is something closer to like 1 to 3 acres potentially coming out of the site and not 10. However, this is still just in the early studies, early feasibility studies. And again, that project is a completely separate project from this project. So the Maritime Reservation scenario is not saying, are we going to have a turning basin expansion or not have a turning basin expansion? It's just acknowledging that a turning basin very well may happen. And if it takes the maximum extent of the chunk out of the site, what would the resulting site plan be? And then we studied the impacts that would potentially be associated with that as well. So we made sure that was fully covered in the CIR.
Okay, I guess I will just sort of say it's not really clear where the port is in this process. So I just I'm not entirely, I guess I don't entirely follow what the dialogue has been on that. So thank you for the clarity. Other questions, commissioners? Commissioner Rank.
Thanks, Chair. I just had a quick follow-up on that. One of the speakers raised the issue of why the port is sort of retaining or offering a reservation instead of doing sort of a right of first refusal If there's this anticipation that they're going to need that land, why are they giving it away in order to take it back instead of the other way around? So I've just thought I'd ask that follow up.
I apologize. I cannot speak to the port's thinking on how they drafted the term sheet.
Fair enough.
Okay. Vice Chair Fern.
Yeah, just one question I came to mind about a commenter mentioned that AB 734 did trigger the analysis of community benefits under CEQA, and I was just wondering if Pete, you could speak to that as well, if that's in fact the case.
Yeah. So what AB 734 requires, it actually requires the community benefits to be part of the project approvals, and they're not required as part of the EIR certification. In fact, the community benefits would likely be part of the development agreement, permit with the city, or the port agreements. And neither of those can actually move forward until an EIR is certified.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.